And when they groan with hunger, God points them to a new economy and pours out food from the sky. Instead of the storehouses of Egypt, God grants them an economy of interdependence, forgiving of debts, generous treatment of the stranger and the alien, systematic redistribution of the land for the needy, and release of those who become bonded servants.
They're given new names, new symbols, new holidays, and a new destiny, nothing short of the redemption of the whole human family. New laws are put into place to be the foundations of this nation that's to be set apart, unlike the other nations. They're given strict guidelines on how to treat the widows and the orphans. Things like Jubilee and gleaning are put into place to make sure that the poor are taken care of and inequality is dismantled. Now, some of the laws may look a little strange to us, like that you can't touch the skin of a pig. What would we do during football season, right? But these laws, others of them may not have the spiritual significance that they did to them, like circumcision. If you don't know what circumcision is, kids, ask your parents. Parents, if you don't know, ask your pastors. Then I don't know what. But these laws were ways that God was branding them and setting them apart as a people, that they were marked as God's people in order to save the world. And these laws, like an eye for an eye, sometimes we misunderstand them. They weren't just permission to do violence, but they were to limit violence. If someone pokes out your eye, then don't poke out both of their eyes. If someone breaks your arm, don't break their arm and their leg. Only an eye for an eye. All these things were ways of saying, if you don't keep these laws, then you'll end up like Egypt. Because God is forming a new people that were to be a culture that was counter-imperial.
It may have only taken a few days to get out of Egypt, but they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to get Egypt out of them. Pharaoh still colonized their imaginations. It was hard to think of life outside of Egypt. They complained nostalgically about the food back in Egypt. Slavery, ironically, seemed more stable than God's exodus. They wanted to be like the other nations around them and have a king and build a temple. But they're scolded and reminded that God likes camping out with them in the wilderness. But with predatory nations all around them, they begin to get scared and push away from having their judges to having a strong monarchy. Kings have militaries and they fight wars. But God assures them that God is their king, but they persist. God warns them what kings do. Hear the words of 1 Samuel 8.
This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us, to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king.
They insist on having a king to be like the other nations. And the prophet Hosea says that in God's anger, God gave them their king. And the prophets over and over remind the people that as the kings do the things kings do, they're only doing the things God told them they would do, and they're kind of getting what they asked for.
But in the move toward a king, we can again see God's upside-down way of doing things, God's way of redemption. A little shepherd boy is chosen to be their king. At one point, he fights a giant with a slingshot. It's clear that God has a very peculiar way of looking at power and strength. It's like when an entire city wall in Jericho was toppled by celebration and music without a single weapon being raised. Or it's like when Gideon rallied an army of over 30,000, but God commanded him to cut the army down again and again till it was a puny little force of 300. That's how God works. Audacious, upside-down power. God's people need not trust in their own strength, in warriors and in chariots. Rather, trust in God's providence. Ironically, this is the intended message carried in the old stories of war and God's protection.
I'd rather own a sling and a stone and stock in a cobra giant. Better wing a light shaking in the boots, cause spirit is out in a riot. I'd rather own a sling and a stone and stock in a cobra giant. Better wing a light shaking in the boots, cause spirit is starting a riot.
So the Bible's filled with stories of kings, and more kings. Adultery, murder, theft, debauchery, but God never gives up on the people. Every king had a prophet, a critic on the margins, sort of a thorn in the flesh for the kings. And while we learn history through the chronology of presidents and kings, God tells history through the prophets. They're the mouthpieces of God. Prophets can make and unmake kings, and sometimes they have enormous popular support, and sometimes nobody listens at all. But nonetheless, they are the voice of God. They feel the things that God feels. God's fire rages through their mouths. As the rabbi Abraham Heschel says, to us, what is a single act of injustice, cheating in business or exploitation of the poor, what is slight, to the prophets was an absolute catastrophe. To us, what is a small injury to the welfare of the people, to the prophets was a death blow to the very existence of the human race. To us, a little episode, to the prophets was a threat to the world. After all, a lot is at stake. And sometimes it just takes one little voice to interrupt the patterns of injustice. And that's what the prophets were. They were people that shattered indifference. And that's why they always did such weird things. Have you ever noticed that? I mean, the prophets, they're always doing stunts and pranks and things like turning staffs into snakes and knocking around on a rock till fire comes out. You know, Jeremiah wore a yoke on his back to symbolize their captivity until he got locked up. And John the Baptist ate locusts and wore camel skin, till he got his head cut off. Not everybody likes the prophets. Ezekiel pulled off a protest in the nude and cooked with poop. I mean, they're weird people, and yet their antics are only there to expose the weird things that we do. They offer us an alternative future than the one that we're headed out, a future where the lion and the lamb can lie down together. And yet we continue to insist on our own ways, on our own chariots and horses and kings and presidents. And so our tears and groaning continue.
As Israel really wanted a king, God reveals to them the most audacious kind of king. In an act of divine conspiracy, Jesus springs from the rubble of Israel's experiments with power to show us what kind of king God is. Even the idea of a kingdom will be subverted and transformed. This king will unveil and show as a farce and a fraud all patterns of domination. In doing so, he will redeem the true power of God, an upside-down power operating according to a very unlikely policy. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. His mother Mary, infused with the true King of the Jews in her womb, sang a song of how God brings down the lofty pretentiousness of the powers.